Okay, so get ready because we're about to dive deep into a really fascinating time period, like the actual birth of modern psychology. We're talking late 1800s, early 1900s. But hold on, put down those textbooks because this isn't about memorizing dates and
Right,
names.
we're going way beyond the typical who did what when.
We're digging into the stuff they don't always teach you, the social forces, the ambition, even the power struggles that were happening behind the scenes. This stuff had a huge impact on how psychology developed, especially here in America.
It's wild to think about psychology didn't just magically appear out of thin air, you know?
Oh, absolutely no.
It was totally woven into the fabric of that time period, shaped by who held the power in academia, what those academics were competing for, even how people were dealing with all the social change happening around them. It all plays in.
And to really understand this, we're diving into the work of a scholar named Kurt Danziger. Specifically, a chapter he wrote called, wait for it, Los Orígenes Sociales de la Psicología Moderna.
Catchy. Right.
Right. It's actually Spanish for the social origins of modern psychology.
Someone's been brushing up on their languages?
Maybe. But seriously, this chapter was originally published back in 1979, but don't worry, we've got all the juicy bits translated for you. And let me tell you, Danziger does not hold back. He really goes after that traditional story we're always told about Wilhelm Wundt and his lab in Leipzig as the beginning of psychology.
That 1879 date, Wundt's lab, it's practically sacred in psychology.
Right, the father of experimental psychology and all that. But Danziger's like, hold up, let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Exactly. Danziger acknowledges what Wundt did, but he calls this laser focus on him a myth of origin. Like later psychologists created this whole narrative about Wundt being the be-all and end-all.
Interesting. So is Danziger saying Wundt wasn't doing important work? Or just that there's more to the story?
That's more that we've oversimplified things. See, Wundt, even with his fancy lab experiments, he still saw psychology as rooted in philosophy.
Huh. So it wasn't just about, like, observing behavior and conducting experiments.
Not entirely. He called psychology the science of the mind, and it was very much about introspection, looking inward at your own thoughts and feelings.
So less about shaping how people act, more about understanding what's going on in their heads.
Exactly, and that's a world away from where psychology, at least in America, would eventually go, which was much more about social control.
Okay, now that's a big difference. We're talking about two totally different approaches.
Right, and this is where it gets fascinating. Because if Wundt wasn't this lone genius who birthed psychology all by himself.
Who or what else was influencing how this new field took shape?
Well, Danziger points to this whole concept of the professional practitioner that was emerging at the time. The idea of the expert was taking hold in a lot of fields.
Like doctors, lawyers. You're saying psychologists saw that and were like, we can be experts too.
Exactly. And Danziger argues that guys like Wundt, they weren't just doing science, they were trying to carve out a place for themselves in this new world where knowledge equals professional power.
So it's like psychology had to prove it deserved a seat at the big kids' table.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in academia, which can be pretty cutthroat. But here's where it gets even juicier. The powers that be, the ones who could legitimize a new field, they weren't all looking for the same things in Germany, where Wundt was, compared to America, where psychology would really take off.
So you're telling me that different countries had different priorities, different needs, and that led to different kinds of psychology emerging.
Precisely. And understanding those differences is key to understanding how psychology developed the way it did.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. What was it about America that made it such fertile ground for psychology to flourish? And why did it develop in this very specific, practical, almost, dare I say, controlling way?
Well, one big difference is that in Germany, philosophy still held a lot of sway in academic circles.
But America was all about practicality.
It was the show me the money era, but for knowledge.
Yeah.
New fields like psychology had to prove they had real-world applications, that they could solve problems people were actually facing.
So no time for ivory tower theorizing. Psychology had to get its hands dirty if it wanted to earn a seat at the table.
Exactly. And it found its niche in tackling the social problems of the day. We're talking about using psychology to improve education, make industries run more smoothly, even figure out how to manage the rapidly growing populations in cities. And this need to be practical to solve real-world problems.
Well, it's important to remember the context, right? I mean, the late 1800s, early 1900s, this was a time of huge change in America.
Oh, absolutely. Industrialization, cities exploding in size, waves of immigrants arriving. People didn't always know what to make of it all. A lot of anxiety bubbling under the surface. Exactly. And that fear, Sometimes it wasn't always rational, but it was definitely there.
People worried about things like social unrest, crime, you name it, this feeling that traditional values were breaking down.
They were looking for answers, for someone to tell them how to navigate this new world. And guess who stepped right up?
Psychologists.
Yeah.
Like, hold on, we've got this. We're the experts on human behavior. We can help you understand, even control what's going on.
Exactly. They presented themselves as having this unique knowledge, these tools to bring order to the chaos. But, and this is important, that expertise, it didn't always benefit everyone equally.
Okay, now we're getting to the heart of it. What do you mean by that? Who was being served by this expertise and who was being left behind?
Think about it, who is often seen as the source of the anxiety, the root of the problem in society.
The other.
Exactly. Often it was immigrants, people of color, the poor, groups who were already marginalized who didn't have a lot of power.
So the very people who might have needed support, understanding.
They ended up being framed as the problem that needed to be fixed. And unfortunately, psychology, in its eagerness to prove its worth, sometimes ended up reinforcing those existing power imbalances.
This is really making me think about those psychology textbooks in a whole new light. Are there specific examples of this dynamic playing out in ways that really drive the point home?
Oh, absolutely. One that comes to mind is the rise of intelligence testing in the early 1900s.
IQ tests.
The very same. They were presented as this objective way to measure mental ability, a scientific way to sort people based on their inherent capability.
But you're suggesting they weren't actually objective.
Not even close. These tests were often incredibly culturally biased, favoring people from privileged backgrounds. They weren't measuring some kind of innate intelligence. They were measuring who was most like the people who created the test in the first place.
So, not exactly a level playing field. What impact did that have?
Well, those biased test results were then used to justify all sorts of discriminatory practices. Everything from immigration restrictions, limiting who was allowed into the country,
To literally separating children in schools based on these flawed notions of intelligence.
Exactly. And this is a perfect example of how something that looks neutral on the surface, like a scientific test, can be used to uphold really unjust systems. It's a reminder that science is never created in a vacuum. It's always influenced by the social and political forces of its time.
It's eye-opening, to say the least. And it sounds like this intertwining of psychology with social control, it went beyond just intelligence testing. Weren't there other areas where this dynamic played out?
Absolutely. Think about clinical psychology, the field that focuses on mental health. Back then, in the late 1800s, physicians, medical doctors, they were the ones with all the power when it came to mental illness.
So if psychologists wanted to be taken seriously in that world.
They had to play by the rules. And in America, those rules were very much defined by the medical model.
Meaning you had to view mental illness as a biological problem, something wrong with the individual's brain or body.
Right. Not so much about social factors, difficult life circumstances, any of that. It was all about identifying the problem within the individual and fixing it.
So even in a field like clinical psychology, which we tend to think of as focus on healing and support.
That same impulse towards control was there, lurking beneath the surface. And that had a huge impact on the kinds of therapies that were developed, how mental illness was classified, even the very language used to talk about mental distress.
It's fascinating and a little bit unsettling to see how this desire for control, for order, played out in so many different realms of psychology. It really makes you wonder, was anyone pushing back against this? Were there alternative perspectives emerging? Or was this drive for social control the dominant force?
Well, that's a great question. And it leads us to one of the most influential and some might say controversial schools of thought in American psychology behaviorism.
So we're back, digging deeper into how modern psychology emerged, and honestly, it's been a wild ride. Who knew there was so much ambition and, well, maybe even a little bit of social engineering going on behind the scenes?
It really makes you think twice about those Psych 101 lectures, huh?
Yeah.
We tend to treat psychology as this neutral, objective field, but Danziger really pulls back the curtain on that.
Totally. Last time we were talking about this tension between wanting to understand the individual and at the same time create a society that runs smoothly, a well-ordered society. That's a tough one to balance, right? So how did American psychology, with its big focus on being practical and, maybe even controlling things a bit, how did it try to reconcile those two impulses?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Danziger's argument is that in a lot of ways, American psychology ended up kind of sidelining the whole individual subjective experience thing.
So, like, in trying to be super scientific, super focused on what they could measure and control.
They kind of lost sight of the inner world, all the messy, complex stuff that makes us human, our consciousness.
They oversimplified things a bit in the name of science.
You could say that.
Yeah.
Think back to behaviorism, which we were talking about earlier. John B. Watson and the other behaviorists, they thought introspection, that whole looking inward at your thoughts and feelings thing, was way too wishy-washy.
Too subjective, not scientific enough for them.
Exactly. They shifted the focus entirely to behavior, just what you could see on the outside, how people react to stuff in the environment.
So instead of trying to unravel the mysteries of the mind, it became all about
controlling the inputs to control the outputs.
like if you can figure out the right buttons to push.
You can make people do just about anything. Or so they thought. Anyway.
So it's less about, let's try to understand the depths of the human experience, and more about,
how can we get people to behave in ways that benefit society?
yeah.
It's a big shift, for sure. And you can see why that kind of thinking would appeal to people at that time, with all the anxieties about a changing world, the fears around immigration, industrialization, all of that.
Makes sense. A nice, neat solution to the unpredictable chaos of human nature. Except we know it's never that simple, right? People are complicated. So what kind of impact did this have in the long run? Did any good come out of it? Or was it all, social engineering gone wrong?
It's definitely not a black and white issue. Like most things in psychology, it's nuanced. On the one hand, that pragmatic problem-solving focus, it did lead to some really effective therapies, especially for behavioral problems. Things like systematic desensitization for phobias, which has helped a lot of people overcome some pretty debilitating fears.
Okay, so that's a win for the practical approach.
Right. It wasn't all just about control and unintended consequences.
Right.
But, and this is a big but, that same focus on external control, on shaping behavior, it also opened the door for some, well, less ethical applications.
Because if you can control behavior for good,
You can control it for other reasons, too. We're talking advertising, propaganda, even more authoritarian regimes using these techniques on their citizens. Anytime you're trying to manipulate people's behavior without their knowledge or consent, that's where things get ethically dicey.
a classic case of a tool that can be used for good or for evil. And a stark reminder that even in fields that are, at their core, about helping people, there's always a potential for harm if we're not careful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why understanding the social and historical roots of psychology is so important. It's not about condemning the whole field or saying it's all bad, not at all. But we need to be aware of those influences, to ask critical questions about how and why certain ideas took hold.
It's about being informed, being thoughtful, and being aware of those forces that have shaped how we view the human mind and behavior.
Exactly. It's about using this knowledge to build a more just and equitable world. A world where psychology is about empowering people, promoting understanding, not about reinforcing power structures or trying to control everyone.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the social origins of modern psychology, what's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with?
Remember, the psychology we learned today, all the theories, the therapies, even just the way we talk about the mind, it's not set in stone. It's not the be-all and end-all of truth. These ideas emerged from a specific time and place, influenced by all sorts of things: ambition, power struggles, the desire for a sense of order in uncertain times. It's a fascinating, complex history.
So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, don't take anything for granted. And on that note,
Keep those brain cells buzzing.
this has been another episode of The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.